The laughter started low. It always did. It started as a smirk at the far end of the conference table, a man in a pressed shirt glancing sideways at his colleague, lips curling at something he had no business finding funny. Then a second smirk answered the first, then a third. A whispered comment passed behind a hand, someone coughed to cover a laugh. The man at the head of the table, the client, the one they had flown in from Portland, the one whose company was worth $43 million and whose signature they had been chasing for 11 weeks, did not hear any of it. That was the point. He sat perfectly still. His hands rested flat on the polished rosewood. His eyes moved carefully from face to face, reading lips the way some people read a room calmly, methodically, missing nothing and hearing nothing all at once. His name was Gerald Fitch. He had been deaf since the age of 7. And somewhere in that glass tower on the 27th floor of the Caldwell and Hargrove building, in a city where everyone moved fast and spoke faster, someone in that room was about to make the worst decision of their career. And someone else, a man no one in that room had bothered to learn the name of, was about to stop it. Building the hero. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 38 years old. He weighed 171 pounds. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow from a fall he never talked about and a callus on his right palm that had been there since he was 22. He wore the same style of watch every day, a Casio black face, rubber strap scratched across the bezel in a diagonal line that looked intentional but wasn't. He had bought it at a pharmacy for $19, 3 months after his daughter's first surgery, because his other watch, the good one, the one his wife had given him, was in a drawer he no longer opened. He worked on the 27th floor of Caldwell and Hargrove. Not in the conference rooms, not in the glass-walled offices where the account executives kept their diplomas in matching frames, not at the long rosewood table where Gerald Fitch would one day sit with his hands flat and his eyes reading the room. Marcus Webb worked in the corridors. He cleaned them. He arrived each morning at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before his shift began, because the elevator to the 27th floor was slower in the morning, and he had learned the timing of it the way a man learns anything that matters to him through patient repetition. He wore a gray uniform with a small embroidered patch on the chest that said facilities in blue thread. He pushed a cart. The cart had a squeaky left wheel that he had reported 3 times and stopped reporting after the 3rd time because the wheel was never fixed, and the reporting took longer than simply accepting the wheel. He had a system. Every morning, the 27th floor followed the same sequence. The executive washrooms first, then the corridor outside the boardroom, then the smaller meeting rooms numbered 27A through 27F, then the open floor, then the break room, then the elevator bank. He moved without hurrying. He worked without making unnecessary noise. He spoke when spoken to and said as little as possible when he was. Most people on the 27th floor did not know his name. Some of them had worked there for 4 years. He didn't mind. His daughter was 9 years old. Her name was Lily. She had fine brown hair and a gap between her 2 front teeth and a laugh that arrived before the joke and stayed after everyone else had stopped. She also had a congenital heart condition that had required 2 surgeries and would require 1 more probably before her 12th birthday, and a medication schedule that Marcus had memorized down to the milligram. He kept a laminated copy of the schedule on the inside cover of the small spiral notebook he carried in his left breast pocket. He had laminated it himself at the copy shop on Delaney Street because the paper had gotten wet once years ago when Lily was still in the hospital the 2nd time, and he had decided that wet paper was not an acceptable risk. He was a man who had learned to identify acceptable risks with great precision. His wife Alina had died 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by September. Marcus had taken 6 days of bereavement leave, returned to work on the 7th day, and never used a sick day since. He had been offered condolences by his supervisor at the time, a round man named Dave who smelled of cigarettes and meant well, and Marcus had said, "Thank you, Dave," and returned to the corridor and continued cleaning it. Not because he didn't grieve. Because grief, like everything else he had learned to carry, was carried quietly. What the 27th floor did not know about Marcus Webb, what nobody in that building except his daughter and 1 other person in the world knew, was that Marcus Webb held a master's degree in applied linguistics from the University of Michigan. He had written his thesis on prosodic variation in American Sign Language syntax. He was fluent in ASL, he was fluent in BSL, he was conversant in LSF French Sign Language, and had working knowledge of tactile sign language used with deafblind individuals. He had spent 8 years before Lily's first surgery working as a certified ASL interpreter for federal court proceedings in the Eastern District of Michigan, appearing in courtrooms where the stakes were measured in decades, where his hands were the only thing that stood between a defendant and a word misunderstood. He had left that work not because he failed at it. He had left because it required travel, because it required unpredictable hours, because Lily had been diagnosed 2 weeks after he received the fastest promotion of his career, and Marcus had looked at his calendar and looked at his daughter and made a calculation that took approximately 4 seconds. He had never discussed this with anyone at Caldwell and Hargrove. He didn't see the point. The job at Caldwell and Hargrove paid $22 an hour with a transit subsidy and a health insurance plan that covered 80% of Lily's medication costs. The hours were predictable. He was home by 4, he made dinner. He helped Lily with her homework, he read to her until she fell asleep. He sat in the kitchen afterwards, sometimes with a book, sometimes with nothing, and let the day go. He had learned a long time ago that a life is not measured by its visibility. His neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Acoffer, watched Lily on evenings Marcus worked late. She was 71 years old and made jollof rice for Lily every Friday without being asked, and Marcus had never found a way to adequately thank her, and so he shoveled her walk in winter without being asked and said nothing about it. On the morning of November 14th, Marcus arrived at 6:47 a.m. as always. The left wheel on the cart squeaked. The 27th floor was quiet. He started with the executive washrooms. He had noticed Gerald Fitch the previous afternoon. The Fitch Architecture Group had sent a pre-meeting materials package to the 27th floor's reception desk, a courier envelope blue and gray with the company's name embossed on the front. Marcus had seen it sitting on the desk when he passed at 2:15 p.m. and had not given it more than a glance. But he had also seen the note clipped to the reception monitor, a yellow square in the handwriting of Donna at the desk that read, Fitch Rep arriving Thursday, 10 a.m. Note: client is deaf, uses ASL interpreter. Confirm interpreter booked W/Hargrove's office. He had read it the way he read everything once, fully, quietly, and moved on. That evening he had called the building's concierge services line, as he sometimes did when he wanted to verify something that bothered him. He asked whether the ASL interpreter had been confirmed for Thursday's Fitch meeting. The woman on the line checked and said she wasn't sure. He asked her to check again. She checked again and said it didn't look like anyone had called the interpreter service. Marcus said thank you and ended the call. He stood in his kitchen for a moment. He looked at the laminated card on the refrigerator, Lily's medication schedule, a second copy, because he kept one in his pocket and one here. Then he made dinner. Thursday came. Gerald Fitch arrived at 9:58 a.m. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the posture of a man who had spent decades in buildings he had designed himself. A certain authority in how he occupied space, how he moved through doorways as if he already understood the structural logic of every room. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie. He carried a leather portfolio that had been repaired at the spine with a strip of dark tape, good leather, old, maintained rather than replaced. He was shown to conference room 27B by a junior account coordinator named Priya Mehta, who was 24 years old, 3 months into her first real job, and who had, upon reading Donna's note that morning, gone to her supervisor, Jordan Kessler, and said quietly, I don't see the interpreter on the schedule. Jordan Kessler was 34, he had attended Vanderbilt. He wore his confidence like a fitted blazer, always on, always smooth. He told Priya it was handled. She asked by whom. He told her not to worry about it. She sat at her desk with her hands very still on her keyboard. Gerald Fitch was shown into conference room 27B. He sat at the end of the rosewood table, opened his portfolio, and waited. The Caldwell and Hargrove team filed in at 10:03. Jordan Kessler, 2 senior account managers named Bryce Callahan and Tomas Rudd, a junior analyst, a woman from the creative team. 6 people total, adjusting chairs, setting laptops, pouring water. No interpreter. Gerald Fitch looked at the group. He removed a small card from his portfolio and passed it to the person nearest him. The card read, I am deaf and use American Sign Language. Please ensure your interpreter is present before we begin. Jordan Kessler read the card. He smiled. He said, absolutely, we'll get that sorted, and said nothing else about it because there was no interpreter to get, and Jordan Kessler had decided sometime in the past 10 days since Donna's note first appeared that the interpreter was an unnecessary expense for what he considered a preliminary conversation. A relationship-building session, he had told himself, nothing formal, nothing that needed a full accommodation setup. He had made this decision quietly. He had not told anyone. He had not told his clients. He had not told Gerald Fitch. The crisis. The meeting began at 10:07 a.m. Jordan Kessler opened with the standard welcome, the practiced confidence, the glossy deck on the wall screen, the careful modulation of his voice that he had spent years perfecting for rooms exactly like this one. He spoke with his hands loosely folded in front of him, not because he was signing. He couldn't sign a single word, but because it was his power posture, the one he defaulted to when he needed to fill a room. Gerald Fitch watched his lips. He was a skilled lip reader. He had been reading lips for 54 years, and he was better at it than most people would ever know. But lip reading has limits that people who can hear never fully understand. It captures perhaps 30 to 40% of spoken English clearly. The rest is context, inference, and exhausting cognitive labor. In a room where multiple people spoke at once, where heads turned away from him, where the lighting was inconsistent and speakers talked with their hands in front of their faces, the comprehension rate dropped further. Gerald Fitch was a 61-year-old man who ran a $43 million architecture firm. He had been in rooms like this before. He sat quietly and watched. The meeting moved into its second phase around 10:19. Jordan was walking through a project portfolio and Bryce Callahan had taken over the narration, a fast speaker, upper register voice, slight Tennessee accent that softened his consonants in ways that made lip reading harder. He gestured widely at the screen and spoke with the enthusiasm of a man who had rehearsed but not polished. Gerald Fitch turned his head slightly. He watched the screen. He wrote a note on the pad in front of him and pushed it across the table. Could you face the screen when you speak, and slow down slightly? Bryce read it. He nodded. He sped up. It was not malice. It was the way some people respond to a note they don't know how to process. They acknowledge it with their face and continue with their body, because slowing down feels condescending and they haven't thought it through and they're in the middle of a presentation, and their brain cannot hold all of that at once. Tomas Rudd leaned slightly toward Bryce and said something low, mouth turned away from the table. Bryce's shoulder moved, a small involuntary motion, the contained response to something he found funny. Gerald Fitch saw it. He had seen it before, in boardrooms, in lobbies, in the offices of people who had underestimated him for 6 decades. He recognized it the way a man recognizes weather. He returned his eyes to the screen. He said nothing. At 10:24, Jordan Kessler said something to the junior analyst, low, mouth turned, and the analyst pressed his lips together. Jordan glanced toward Gerald Fitch, seemed to check whether the glance had been caught, and then looked back at his screen. It had been caught. Gerald Fitch's hands, which had been resting flat on the table, moved slightly. He pressed them flatter. His expression did not change. At 10:27, the thing happened that broke the room open. Bryce Callahan, describing a phase of a project timeline, said something quick and careless and spoken at half volume. And the words "what does he think we're saying" were not fully spoken, but the shape of them moved through the room. And 2 people at the table covered their responses poorly, and Gerald Fitch did not hear it but read it clearly in the alignment of 3 faces. He closed his portfolio. He stood. He was not angry, or rather he was, but the anger had no available expression in that room. No interpreter, no voice, no mechanism through which he could say what needed to be said and have it received with the weight it deserved. Standing was the only thing available to him that carried any meaning at all. He reached for his jacket, folded over the back of the chair. Marcus Webb was in the corridor. He had been working the stretch outside conference room 27B since 10:15, moving methodically, wiping down the glass partition that separated the corridor from the open floor, restocking the supply closet 3 doors down, working back. He had been aware, as he always was, of the sounds of the room, the projected tone of a presentation, the rhythm of voices, the particular quality of silence that a room produces when something has shifted inside it. He heard chairs move. He heard the change in register. The door to conference room 27B opened. Gerald Fitch stepped into the corridor. He was putting on his jacket with the economy of a man who did not need to rush, who had already made his decision, who was simply completing one action before beginning the next. His portfolio was under his arm. His face was composed. Marcus was 4 feet away, cart to the side, cloth in hand. He and Gerald Fitch looked at each other. It was 3 seconds, perhaps 4. And in those 3 or 4 seconds, Marcus Webb understood not from the expression on the man's face, not from anything he could have named, but from the specific angle of a man's jaw when he has been insulted in a room full of people and has had no mechanism to respond. From the exact way a person holds their shoulders when they are deciding to leave with dignity rather than stay and fight without tools. He understood. He looked at Gerald Fitch. He set down the cloth. And in American Sign Language, clean, practiced, fluent, the hands moving with the particular precision of a man who had spent 8 years in federal courtrooms where a wrong sign could alter a verdict, Marcus Webb signed 3 words. I see you. Gerald Fitch stopped. Not like a man who had been startled. Like a man who had walked through a dark room and found, unexpectedly, a light already on. He looked at Marcus's hands, he looked at Marcus's face, then he looked at his hands again. He signed back. Are you an interpreter? Marcus signed no facilities. Gerald Fitch looked at the gray uniform, the embroidered patch, the cart with the squeaky wheel. He signed, can you come in? Marcus looked at the door to conference room 27B. He looked at Gerald Fitch. He said quietly out loud, not for Fitch, who wouldn't hear it, but for the corridor, for no one, for himself, all right. And he walked in. The room had not settled. Jordan Kessler was standing at the far end of the table, laptop half closed, the particular stillness of a man calculating damage. Bryce Callahan had his arms crossed. Tomas Rudd was looking at his phone. The junior analyst was looking at nothing. Gerald Fitch walked back to his chair at the head of the table and sat. Marcus stopped at the midpoint of the room, beside the wall, and waited. He was a man in a gray uniform with a squeaky-wheeled cart standing in a corporate conference room built for a different kind of person entirely. And he stood there the way he stood everywhere, upright, quiet, occupying exactly the space he had chosen to occupy and no more. Jordan Kessler looked at him. He said, can I help you? Marcus said, Mr. Fitch would like to continue the meeting. I'll interpret. A bead. Kessler said, you're a... Oh, yes. Kessler looked at the gray uniform again. He looked at Gerald Fitch. He looked back at Marcus. He said, that's okay, sure, that works. He didn't believe it would work. He said, sure, the way people say sure when they mean this is temporary and I'll address it later. Gerald Fitch had already reopened his portfolio. What happened in the next 40 minutes was, by any professional measure, extraordinary. Marcus Webb stood at the midpoint of conference room 27B and interpreted, not in the simplified, slightly hesitant way of someone performing a skill they've half remembered, fluently, precisely. He caught Bryce Callahan's fast cadence and matched it without losing a word. He paced himself to the natural rhythm of the conversation, his hands moving with the particular economy of a man for whom language, in all its forms, was not a performance but a tool, something to be used accurately and without decoration. Gerald Fitch, who had been a quiet man under extraordinary cognitive strain for the previous 40 minutes, became a different person in the room. He asked questions. Sharp ones. He had reviewed Caldwell and Hargrove's portfolio and had specific concerns about their structural consultation process on mixed-use residential projects. Concerns that were detailed, technical, and demonstrated a depth of preparation that no one in the room had anticipated, because no one in the room had taken him seriously enough to anticipate it. Priya Mehta, who had slipped back into the room 2 minutes after Gerald Fitch returned, stood against the back wall with her notepad and watched. She watched Jordan Kessler's face as Marcus interpreted Fitch's questions, watched the moment Kessler stopped looking at the gray uniform and started looking at Gerald Fitch with something adjacent to alarm, because the man across the table knew more about their firm's structural weaknesses than anyone had expected, and was now saying so clearly. And Marcus Webb was delivering every syllable of it with the calm precision of a man who had once interpreted drug conspiracy cases in federal court and found corporate architecture meetings comparatively relaxed. At one point, Gerald Fitch signed something long and precise. Marcus interpreted. He says his firm walked away from a $58 million contract with Harlow Group in 2019 because Harlow's team made a joke about his deafness in the first meeting. He found out 2 years later. He says he found out because someone told him. He is telling you this now because he would prefer to know what kind of room this is before he commits to it. The silence that followed was of a particular quality. Jordan Kessler was very still. Bryce Callahan had uncrossed his arms. Tomas Rudd had put his phone face down on the table. Marcus Webb waited. Gerald Fitch looked around the room. He looked at each face in turn, then he looked at Marcus Webb. He signed something short. Marcus interpreted. He says, "What you do in the next 5 minutes is what he'll remember." Jordan Kessler did not know what to do with that. He was an intelligent man, that was the thing. He wasn't a villain from a story, not exactly. He was a man who had gotten very good at performing competence and had somewhere along the way confused the performance with the substance. He had made a decision about the interpreter that he had told himself was practical. He had laughed at a comment he should have shut down. He had built a career on reading rooms and he had catastrophically misread this one. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, "Mr. Fitch, I owe you an apology." He said it without theater. He said it the way a man says a thing he means but doesn't know how to carry flat, inadequate landing badly. Gerald Fitch watched Marcus's hands. He nodded once. He did not sign anything. He picked up his pen and wrote something on his notepad and slid it across the table to Marcus. Marcus read it. He looked at it for a moment. He folded it once and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at Jordan Kessler. He says the apology is noted. He says he'll make a decision about this partnership by Monday. Kessler nodded. The meeting ended at 11:31 a.m. Gerald Fitch stood, shook hands around the table, firm, brief, professional, and paused when he reached Marcus Webb. He did not shake his hand. He signed something. Marcus watched. He nodded. He signed back 2 words. Fitch put on his jacket, picked up his portfolio, and left. Priya Mehta at the back of the room had been writing on her notepad the entire time. She had written down everything, every exchange, every silence, every second of it. She was the only one in the room who had. Marcus collected his cloth from where he had left it on the cart in the corridor. He checked his watch, the Casio scratched across the bezel, and noted the time. 11:33. He had 22 minutes before his break. He needed to finish the corridor outside rooms 27C through 27F. He moved the cart. The left wheel squeaked. He did not hear the conversation that happened in conference room 27B after he left. But Priya Mehta heard it. She had stayed, or rather, she had realized she was still in the room and that no one had noticed her there, and she had made the decision, with the specific moral clarity of a person who is 3 months into her first real job and still young enough to believe that clarity is worth something, to remain and listen. Jordan Kessler said to Bryce Callahan, "We need to figure out who that is." Bryce said, "He's custodial, he's on the facilities roster." Jordan said, "Find out if he has any certifications, anything we can use." He didn't say use in a threatening way. He said it in the way of a man who was already reframing the narrative, already building the story in which Jordan Kessler had resourcefully deployed an in-house asset to salvage a critical client meeting. Priya wrote that down too. She wrote 10:27 laughing, 10:29 Bryce, what does he think we're saying? 11:33 find what we can use. She capped her pen. She looked at what she'd written. Then she sent an email not to Jordan, not to anyone on the 27th floor, but to the office of Catherine Hargrove, managing director of Caldwell and Hargrove on the 34th floor. The subject line was, "Ray Fitch meeting 11:14, something you should know." Oh, she hit send. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the keyboard. She thought about the man in the gray uniform and the 22 minutes he had spent interpreting a meeting he hadn't been invited to, and then returning to a cart in a corridor. She thought about what it costs to carry something quietly for a very long time. She went back to her desk. The reckoning. Catherine Hargrove read the email at 6:41 the following morning. She read it in the back of the car that took her from her apartment on the Upper West Side to the Caldwell and Hargrove building each morning. The same black car, the same driver, the same route. While she drank the first half of a coffee that was always too hot and scrolled through the overnight messages she handled before reaching the building. She read Priya's email twice. Then she put her phone face down on the seat. She looked out the window. The city moved past in the gray of early November, scaffolded buildings, yellow cabs, a woman walking a dog that stopped suddenly for no visible reason. Normal, ordinary, moving. Catherine Hargrove had run Caldwell and Hargrove for 9 years. She had taken it from a firm bleeding accounts and reputation and rebuilt it with a specific kind of discipline, ethical sourcing of contracts, zero tolerance for the kind of interpersonal corrosion that rotted firms from the inside, a firm-wide culture document she had written herself, late at night the first year, that began with the sentence, "We will be the firm that does the work and means it." She had not read the culture document in some time. She turned her phone back over. She read the email a third time. She called Jordan Kessler's office at 7:02 and asked him to come to the 34th floor at 9. Then she called Gerald Fitch's executive assistant in Portland and asked whether Mr. Fitch had a moment this week for a call. The assistant said Mr. Fitch did not take phone calls. Catherine said, "I know, I'll come to Portland." The pause. The assistant said she would check. The meeting with Jordan Kessler lasted 40 minutes. It was conducted in Catherine's office, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows on the south and east walls, a view of the city that had looked like power for 9 years and felt that morning like exposure. She sat at her desk. He sat across from it. She did not show him Priya's email. She asked him to describe the Fitch meeting in his own words. He did. It was well constructed, the interpreter issue framed as a logistical oversight, the rescue by the facility's staff framed as resourceful improvisation, his own apology framed as magnanimous leadership under pressure. He told the story with the skill of a man who had been telling stories professionally for a decade. She listened without expression. When he finished, she said, "Tell me about the comment at 10:27. His face moved. It was very small, the particular micro-expression of a man who thought no one had a timestamp, but she had been watching for it and she saw it. He said he wasn't sure what she meant. She said, "I have a detailed account of the meeting from someone who was present. I want to give you the opportunity to tell me what happened before I tell you what I already know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about the comment. He said it had been inappropriate. He said he had addressed it in the room. He said these things with a tone that was almost honest, almost contrition, but threaded through with the kind of qualification that reveals itself as excuses at the end. The pressure of the meeting, a difficult situation, it wasn't as bad as it might have sounded. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. She said, "And the interpreter?" He said it was a logistical error. She said, "You received Donna's note on November 4th. The meeting was the 14th, 10 days. He said, "I dropped the ball on follow-through." She said, "You decided the accommodation wasn't necessary." He didn't answer. She said, "Those are not the same thing, Jordan." She pulled the employment records for Marcus Webb at 10:15 a.m. that same morning. She read them in her office with the door closed. She read them slowly. The employment file for Marcus Webb contained hire date, position title, facilities technician II, shift assignment, salary, health insurance enrollment, standard plus dependent child, and an emergency contact, a Mrs. Amara Akaffer of 114 Delaney Street. It did not contain his graduate degree. It did not contain his federal certification as a court interpreter. It did not contain 8 years of professional ASL interpretation in federal legal proceedings. None of that was in the file because he had not submitted it. The application for a facilities technician II position at Caldwell and Hargrove had not asked for graduate degrees or professional certifications. It had asked for availability, physical capacity, and a clean background check. He had answered all three. She closed the file. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Then she picked up her phone and called Dave Sewell, the facilities supervisor. She said, "I need to speak with Marcus Webb. This afternoon, if possible. Please don't make it sound like a disciplinary matter." Dave said, "He hasn't done anything wrong, has he?" She said, "No." Dave said, "Good, he's a real quiet guy, but he shows up every day and he does good work, doesn't complain about much." She said, "I know." She didn't know, she hadn't known his name 48 hours ago. That was its own kind of information. Marcus was told at 2:30 p.m. that the managing director would like to speak with him. He was in the corridor outside 27D at the time. He said, "All right." He finished the section he was cleaning. He washed his hands in the supply closet sink. He straightened the collar of his uniform. He took the elevator to the 34th floor. Catherine Hargrove stood when he came in. He noticed that. He noted it the way he noted most things, registering it, filing it, not reacting. She said, "Mr. Webb, thank you for coming up." He said, "Of course." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. He sat, she sat. She said, "I want to talk about what happened in the Fitch meeting yesterday." He said, "All right." She said, "I understand you served as interpreter for the duration of the meeting." "For part of it." "For most of it." "Oh, yes." She looked at him. He returned the look with the particular stillness of a man who was comfortable being looked at and did not need to fill the space. She said, "I understand you're a certified ASL interpreter." My certification lapsed in 2021. I didn't renew it." "Why not?" "The renewal requires continuing education hours. The courses are evenings and weekends. My daughter's schedule doesn't accommodate that easily." She said, "I see." He said nothing. She said, "You have a master's in applied linguistics from Michigan." "Yes." "You interpreted in federal court for 8 years." "Eastern District, yes." She looked at her desk for a moment, then back at him. She said, "Why are you working on the 27th floor?" He said, "The hours work. The health plan covers my daughter's medication." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without complaint, without any of the self-pity that the situation might have invited, because pity was a thing he had no use for and had learned to give off no signal that invited it. Catherine Hargrove was quiet. She said, "I'm sorry you had to step into that room the way you did." He said, "The situation needed to be addressed." She said, "You didn't have to do it." He said, "No." She said, "Why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Because Mr. Fitch deserved to be in the room." 3 words, or something close to 3, the kind of sentence that arrives fully formed because it doesn't need construction. She looked at him. She said, "I want to offer you a different role." He said, "I appreciate that." She said, "But." He said, "I don't have a but, I have conditions." He said it without any particular weight on the word conditions, not as a negotiating posture, as a fact. She said, "Tell me." He told her. He spoke for approximately 6 minutes. He did not use notes. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in the same register he used in the corridor, level, considered, precisely economical. He said that any new role would need to maintain the same shift hours, with flexibility on a 30-minute margin either direction. He said that the health insurance plan could not change, specifically the dependent child provision and the medication coverage. He said he was not interested in a title that existed to make the company look good. He said that if he was going to return to interpreting work in any professional capacity, he would need the firm to cover the renewal of his certification, the courses, the fees, and the time on company hours. He said that the 27th floor needed a formal accessibility audit, not suggested, not scheduled for someday, scheduled in writing within 30 days. He said that Priya Mehta should receive recognition for what she did. He didn't say he knew what she'd done. He didn't need to say that. He said the last thing quietly, almost as an afterthought, though it was not an afterthought. "I'd like to continue the work on 27 until a proper replacement is trained. The floor has a system. It should be handed over correctly." She said, "You want to train your own replacement?" He said, "The work matters. It should be done right." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "Do you have any questions for me?" He said, "One." He said, "What happened with Mr. Fitch?" She said, "I'm going to Portland tomorrow to apologize personally. I'd like to know, was there anything he said or signed that I should know before I go?" Marcus thought for a moment. He said before he left that the firm wasn't what he expected. She said, "In a bad way." Marcus said he meant the man with the cart. She sat alone in her office for a while after he left. Her assistant knocked at 4:15 and she said, "Not yet." She sat. She thought about the firm she had built. She thought about the culture document she had written in the first year, the sentence that began it, the thing she had meant when she wrote it. She thought about a man who had carried a graduate degree and 8 years of federal court experience into a gray uniform and a corridor on the 27th floor, who had walked into a room without being asked, who had interpreted a 40-minute meeting, and then returned to his cart and his squeaky wheel and his $22 an hour shift. She thought about the note that Gerald Fitch had written and passed across the table to Marcus at the end of the meeting. The note that Marcus had folded and set on the table and never mentioned to her. She thought about what it might have said. She didn't know, she hadn't asked, it wasn't hers to ask. She looked at the city outside the window. She said quietly to no one, "What kind of room is this?" It was not a question. The resolution. Portland was cold on the morning of November 16th. Catherine Hargrove arrived at the offices of the Fitch Architecture Group at 9:00 a.m. She had taken a 6:15 flight and taken a car from the airport and sat in the car thinking about what she was going to say. She had prepared remarks. She had discarded them somewhere over Connecticut and had decided to say what was true without preparation. The Fitch Architecture Group occupied the fourth and fifth floors of a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, exposed brick, steel beams, natural light distributed through skylights in the ceiling. It was, she thought, the office of a man who designed space for people to actually live and work in, not to perform living and working. Gerald Fitch's assistant met her at the elevator. She was brought to a conference room. Not the main one, a smaller room with a round table, no head, nowhere to sit that implied hierarchy. She noticed that. Gerald Fitch arrived at 9:08. He shook her hand, he sat. She had arranged for an interpreter, a woman named Sandra, a staff interpreter from a Portland firm, who sat at the table's edge with the quiet professionalism of someone who understood that her job was to be present and invisible. Catherine said, "I came to apologize." Sandra interpreted. Gerald Fitch watched. He did not sign anything yet. Catherine said, "What happened in that room was a failure of our firm's basic obligations, to you as a client and to you as a person. We did not provide the accommodation we promised. We created an environment where you were mocked, and we placed the burden of fixing that failure on a man we have undervalued in our own building for 2 years." She did not use words like oversight or miscommunication. She had decided in the car from the airport that those words were for the people who needed to feel better, not for the person who deserved the apology. She said, "I am sorry." Sandra's hands moved. Gerald Fitch watched. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his portfolio on the tables, the leather one repaired at the spine. He looked at it without opening it. "He signed something." Sandra interpreted. "He says, how is the man with the cart?" Catherine said, "He's well, we're in discussions about a new role." Sandra interpreted. Fitch signed. Sandra said, "He wants to know if the new role is the man's idea or yours." Catherine said, "He set the conditions, I accepted them." Sandra interpreted. Something happened in Gerald Fitch's expression, not a smile exactly, the particular movement of a face that has been very still for a very long time. "He signed for some time." Sandra interpreted. "He says there is a project, 41 units of accessible housing in the Northeast. His firm leads the architecture. He needs a consulting partner for the interior systems planning. He has been looking for 2 years. He says the firm he chooses has to be the kind of firm that has a man like that in its corridors. Not in its boardrooms, in its corridors, where the real work is." He kept signing. Sandra interpreted. "He says he would like Caldwell and Hargrove to submit a proposal. He says, tell the man with the cart." The thing about the 27th floor of Caldwell and Hargrove in the days that followed was that it went on being the 27th floor. This is the part of the story that is easy to miss, the part where nothing cinematic occurs. There was no triumphant gathering, no public declaration, no slow-motion corridor walk set to orchestral music. Marcus Webb arrived on Monday at 6:47 a.m. He pushed the cart, the left wheel still squeaked. His conversation with Catherine Hargrove had resulted in a formal offer letter delivered Friday afternoon to his personal email address, which he had read once at his kitchen table while Lily ate cereal across from him, and told him about something that had happened at school involving a substitute teacher and a hamster that had escaped from its cage during math. He had read the letter. He had said, Lily had said, "What?" He said, "Work thing." She said, "Good or bad?" He said, "Good, I think." She said, "The hamster got loose and hid inside the teacher's desk and scratched around in there for 20 minutes before anyone found it." He said, "That's terrible." She said, "It was kind of great." He had signed the letter Friday night. He reported to the 27th floor Monday morning because he had said he would train his replacement, and he was going to train his replacement. The accessibility audit of the 27th floor was scheduled for December 2nd, 30 days from the date of the conversation in Catherine's office to the day. Catherine had put it in writing as he had asked. She had also put it in writing that Priya Mehta was to receive a formal commendation in her personnel file effective immediately and a transition to a senior coordinator role, a promotion that skipped a level, with the explanation written plainly in the record. Priya found out on Monday morning. She sat at her desk and looked at the email from HR for a long time. She went to find Marcus in the corridor. She said, "They told me what you said." He said, "I told them what you did." She said, "You didn't have to." He said, "You wrote it down, you sent it. You made it possible for someone to know what happened, that's the work." She stood there for a moment. She said, "Why did you step in that day into the meeting?" He thought about it. He wasn't a man who answered questions before he thought about them. He said Mr. Fitch was in a room full of people and he couldn't reach them. No one could hear him, not because he's deaf, because they weren't listening. She said, "And you were." He said, "I was in the corridor." He said it the way he said most things, without any weight on it, like a simple fact about where a person was. She nodded. She went back to her desk. The public apology came 11 days later, on November 25th. It was not planned as a public apology. It was planned as an all-hands meeting of the 27th floor, a format Jordan Kessler had used before for team updates and pipeline reviews. Catherine Hargrove had asked to address the floor and Jordan Kessler had facilitated it, because by that point Jordan Kessler's facilitation was the least contentious aspect of his situation, and he was performing every small cooperative gesture available to him. What Jordan Kessler's situation was, precisely, was still being processed through HR in the manner these things are processed, carefully documented, with the particular slowness of an institution that values getting it right above getting it fast. He had not been separated. He had been placed on a performance improvement plan of a specific and unambiguous kind, with conditions attached to his remaining at the firm that were documented in 12 pages of HR language and 4 words from Catherine Hargrove. Not ever again. He had signed it. He had meant it, or he was working on meaning it, which, in the human machinery of change, is sometimes the best available beginning. The all-hands gathered in the open floor of 27 at 2:00 p.m. 61 people, account managers, analysts, coordinators, 2 junior partners, the creative team, the administrative staff. Priya Mehta stood near the back. Jordan Kessler stood at the side. Marcus Webb stood at the edge of the gathering in his gray uniform, cart behind him, because he had been cleaning the corridor when people began to assemble and had not left. Catherine Hargrove stood at the center. She did not have notes. She said, "I want to address something that happened in this floor 11 days ago. Some of you know about it, some of you don't." She told them what had happened in conference room 27B on November 14th. She told it plainly. She named the failure, she named the comment, she named the decision about the interpreter that had been made and the person who had made it. She did not sensationalize, she did not protect anyone with vague language. Then she said, "The meeting was salvaged," and I use that word intentionally, because this firm came very close to permanently damaging a relationship with a client and a person who deserved better. The meeting was salvaged by someone on this floor. She looked toward Marcus. He was standing at the edge. She said Marcus Webb stepped into that room without being asked. He interpreted a 40-minute meeting in a language he spent 8 years mastering, a career he stepped away from not because he failed at it, but because his daughter needed him to be home at 4. The floor was very quiet. She said, "As of this week, Marcus will be transitioning to a new role as our firm's first in-house accessibility liaison and ASL consultant, working across all floors and all client-facing operations. His certification renewal is being funded by the firm and completed on company time." She looked at him. She said, "We should have known who you were. That's on us, not you." Marcus looked back at her. He did not say anything. He gave a single nod. Priya at the back of the room was writing on her notepad. She always had her notepad. After the meeting dispersed, someone asked Marcus if he wanted to say a few words. He said no. The person, one of the junior partners, who had attended some speaking program and believed in the power of the moment, said, "Really, nothing." Marcus thought for a second. He said, "Priya Mehta sent the email. Jordan's team did the work I interpreted. Mr. Fitch drove this meeting to a better place. I was in the corridor." The junior partner said, "You did more than that." Marcus said I was in the right place. He moved his card. The left wheel squeaked. The note from Gerald Fitch, the one he had written and passed across the table at the end of the meeting on November 14th, the one Marcus had folded and set down and never shown anyone, was found 11 days later when Marcus was clearing out the personal items from his cart. He had forgotten it was there. Or he had not forgotten, it is hard to say which, and Marcus Webb was not a man who drew clear lines between forgetting and leaving something alone until he was ready for it. He unfolded it at his kitchen table. Lily was already in bed, the house was quiet. There was a cup of tea to his right, not hot enough, the way it always ended up when he made it. The note was on Fitch Architecture Group stationery, cream-colored, the firm's initials embossed at the top. Gerald Fitch's handwriting was angular and precise. It said, "My interpreter died last spring, 41 years, his name was David, I haven't found the right person since. GF." Marcus read it twice. He folded it carefully. He set it beside the cup of tea. He sat for a while. Outside, November moved through the street without sound. A car passed, a dog somewhere briefly, the particular quality of a city at the late end of a weekday settling into itself. He thought about a man in a charcoal suit with a leather portfolio, repaired at the spine, sitting at the head of a rosewood table with his hands flat, reading a room he couldn't hear. He thought about 41 years. He thought about the word right. He got up, he washed the cup, he turned off the kitchen light. He checked on Lily, the particular stillness of a sleeping child, the sound of her breathing slow and steady, and then he went to the drawer he didn't usually open. He opened it. He took out his good watch, the one Alina had given him, the one with the real leather strap and the small crack at the 9 o'clock position from the time he dropped it running to the hospital parking garage. He held it in his hand for a moment. Then he set it on the nightstand. Not the drawer. The nightstand. He wasn't ready to wear it again, but there was a difference between a drawer and a nightstand, and he understood the difference, and the difference was enough. Marcus Webb reported to the 27th floor Tuesday at 6:47 a.m. Not with the cart. He had handed the cart to the man he had trained, a young guy named Felipe, 26, first week, who took notes on everything and had already identified that the left wheel needed to be fixed and had filled out the repair request in triplicate and followed up twice. Marcus had said good. He rode the elevator in his regular clothes, now dark pants, the kind that didn't wrinkle, a plain button-down, no tie, the Casio on his wrist scratched across the bezel, the small spiral notebook in his left breast pocket, the laminated card visible at its edge. He went to the small office that had been converted for him on the northwest corner of 27. It had a window. It had a desk and a chair and a whiteboard on one wall, and as of yesterday, a small framed print that Lily had made at school. A painting in the broad, unself-conscious style of a 9-year-old, blue and green and yellow, something that might have been a bird or a boat or simply a shape she had liked, which he had taped to the wall at desk height where he could see it without looking up. He sat. He opened his notebook to a clean page. At the top, he wrote the date. Below that, he wrote Accessibility Audit, 27th floor, Scheduled Deck 2, Prep. He uncapped his pen. He looked at the window. The city was gray-bright in the early November morning, the particular light that arrives before warmth, that illuminates without heat, buildings, sky, the distant movement of people who were already somewhere they needed to be. He bent his head. He began to work. What stayed on the 27th floor after all of it, after the meeting and the audit and the apology and the reassignments and the careful paperwork of institutional correction, was not the drama of it. It was the smaller things. It was Priya Mehta who started keeping a notebook at every meeting from that day forward, not because she was told to, but because she had learned something about the difference between what is said and what is recorded, and she intended never to confuse them again. It was Jordan Kessler who requested training in ASL 3 weeks after his performance plan was signed, attended 4 sessions before the holidays, and was not good at it yet and came back anyway. It was the accessibility audit, completed on December 2nd, as scheduled, which generated a 19-page report that Marcus delivered without ceremony to Catherine Hargrove's office, and which resulted in 7 structural changes to how the 27th floor operated and a firm-wide policy, and eventually a standard that Caldwell and Hargrove presented at an industry conference the following April. Marcus was not at the conference. He had been invited. He had said, "Thank you, I have other plans." His other plans were Lily's school concert, which was at 6:00 p.m. on the same evening, in a gymnasium that smelled of floor cleaner and something like popcorn, where children in mismatched concert attire performed a medley of songs with the particular chaotic sincerity of people who have practiced something and care about it and are terrified and glad. Lily played the triangle. She played it with absolute seriousness. She was the only person in the gymnasium who was playing the triangle with that level of commitment, and Marcus watched from the third row of folding chairs. And at some point his face did something that he wasn't controlling, and he let it do it, because the gymnasium was full of people looking at their own children and nobody was looking at him. Afterward, walking to the car, Lily said, "Did you see when I came in on the wrong beat?" He said, "I saw." She said, "It was pretty bad." He said, "It wasn't that bad." She said, "Dad." He said, "Okay, it was a little bad." She laughed. It arrived before the joke was finished, the way her laugh always did. He put his hand on the top of her head briefly, the particular touch of a parent who is trying to do it casually and not quite managing casual. They walked to the car. The night was cold. The stars, if you could see them through the city light, were probably there. Gerald Fitch's accessible housing project, 41 units in the Northeast, designed for residents with a full range of mobility, sensory, and accessibility needs, broke ground the following spring. Caldwell and Hargrove's proposal had been accepted. In the project documents, the architectural brief, the accessibility standards annex, the client consultant framework, there was a section that had been requested specifically by the Fitch Architecture Group. It was titled Language Access and Communication Standards. It was written by Marcus Webb. It was 11 pages long, precise and practical, and without a single word that wasn't necessary. His name appeared on the cover at the bottom below the title in the same size font as everything else. He had asked for that specifically. Not larger. The same size. In the corridor of the 27th floor, Felipe kept the cart clean. He fixed the left wheel. It stopped squeaking. He reported the floor in the same order every morning: executive washrooms, corridor outside the boardroom, smaller meeting rooms 27A through 27F, open floor, break room, elevator bank. He had learned the system from the previous guy. He had been told the previous guy was thorough. He had been told the previous guy had a system, and the system mattered, and the work mattered, and to do it right. He did it right. On a Tuesday in March, Marcus was walking the hall between 27C and 27D, old habit, still checking the corridor sometimes, not because it needed him, but because some things stay with you, when he passed Felipe and Felipe said, "Morning." And Marcus said, "Morning, how's the wheel?" Felipe said, "Fixed." Marcus said, "Good." He kept walking. The corridor was clean. The floor was exactly what it was: 30 feet of linoleum and glass and fluorescent light, part of a building in a city full of buildings, ordinary in every visible way. He knew what it cost to keep it. He walked it anyway. Some people carry their whole lives in their hands. Others carry them in a corridor. Both ways, if you do it right, the weight becomes something else. It becomes the work.